is going on, particularly being led by the University of Jaffna. And particular thanks to Professor Surendra Kumaran and Dr. Kumaran, because I think you all have in a way made my job easier for me. They have laid out the most important issues that we need to be focusing on. So, you know, we see in the media, you would have seen every day in newspapers, television, there's talk about war on drugs. We must wage a war on drugs, particularly from the government. So this is not new. Historically, if you see all over the world, in many parts of the world, in the United States of America, in many countries in South America, even going far back as more than 20 years, 30 years, they have waged these war on drugs. And what has been the impact of that war on drugs is that the people who have been most affected are the poor, are the marginalized. The people who are actually involved in the high-profile trafficking sale, they're rarely touched, very, very rarely. So the ones who end up in prison are the people who use drugs, or the people who sell drugs because they need to get money to use them, and they often come from the poorest sections of society. So what is the Sri Lankan experience? Here we have a militarized war on drugs. We had the National Dangerous Drugs Control Board, which is the main institution in Sri Lanka that formulates policy and also monitors, drug use. It was within the purview of the Ministry of Defense, and now it is within the purview of the Ministry of Public Security. Now, in a democracy, there are very clear roles designated for the military, and it does not include becoming involved in drug control or drug detention or drug treatment. We have two compulsory drug treatment centers, which is Kandakadu and Senapura, which are managed by the military. Now, once again, this really should not be done, because as professor and doctors said, what they reiterated is any response to drug treatment needs to be led by the Ministry of Health, by health experts. It has to be a health-driven approach, not a militarized approach. And also there is this, war against drugs is equated with war against terrorism. We have also seen what are called encounter killings or shootouts, extrajudicial killings of people who have been arrested for drug offenses. Now, if you look at the media, how do the state and the media portray people who use drugs or have drug dependence issues? They are portrayed as evil and as a danger to society. They are referred to as addicts or drug traffickers. So they use the words addict and drug traffickers in the same way. So they're equating people who use or have a dependency with people who traffic, which really should not be the case. Now, the Ministry of Public Security, it was quoted, I think, last year, saying that individuals who are engaged in drug use are responsible for 40% of all criminal activities. Now, I would like to know what is the methodology they used, what is their sample size, how did they gather this information, but of course, none of that is accessible to us. So when you make people who use drugs or people who have this drug dependency, drug use disorder we call it, when you make them into these demons, then that creates an environment where it becomes okay for the state, the government, to do anything to them. You can shoot and kill them in shootouts, people don't care. Why? They're bad people, evil people, that's okay. And so that is actually quite dangerous. If you look, women, now this discussion on drug policies and drug use, women, there's no discussion about women. How are they impacted? How are they involved in this? Now, when I was at the Human Rights Commission, we did the prison study, and we found that 24% of convicted women in prison were there for drug offenses, and 62% of the people on remand were also held, the women were held for drug offenses. Now, because of this, I have started doing a study interviewing women who were sent to prison for drug offenses. And what I have found, I see a pattern emerging. The pattern is that so far, all the women I have interviewed, they were pulled or pushed into the drug trade, and that was often by a male member related to them. It could be a husband, it was a boyfriend, it was a brother. In one case, the mother and the sister were arrested because the son of the family was involved in, sale of drugs. But of course, the women had actually nothing to do with it. They had actually no idea that he was doing it. But they were arrested and even remanded for several months. So how does the system function? We have the Police Narcotics Bureau, that's a specialized unit within the police that is tasked with conducting investigations into drug cases. But I think, like even Justice Anand Raja would tell you, there are a number of shortcomings in the system. Shortcomings in law, shortcomings in practice, and what it does, it creates a space for misconduct and malpractices within the police department. Now, this is not what I am saying. This is what, for instance, many Supreme Court decisions say. High Court judgments say this. Court of Appeal judgments say this. So this is not just me saying. And for the last 2 years, what we have seen reports in the media, you also might have seen, 34 police officers, 5 security officers, and 7 government officials were arrested for involvement in drug trafficking. Now, these are only the reported cases that I have seen and I have monitored. So that also shows that there is involvement of people from within the state sector in the trafficking. Now, also women who were arrested for these drug offenses, they said they were subject to invasive body cavity searches. You would have seen a few days ago, the person, I think her name is Piyamali, right? She was arrested for that big fraud case. Even she said that she was subjected to body searches that led to injuries. Now, once again, I know our colleagues from the police are also here, but I'm sure they also know that there are Supreme Court decisions as well that have found that Article 11 of our Constitution, which is the protection against torture, that it was violated, because in police custody we have seen that violence being used, torture, etc. for drug-related offenses is quite common. When I was in the Human Rights Commission, we received many complaints. On average, we used to receive 400 complaints. And of course, there's Mr. Kanagaraj here who deals with many of the complaints that arise from in Jaffna. So what we have seen in terms of the drug control is lack of oversight and accountability. Right? So this has also can lead to room to interfere with investigations, falsifying crucial details. So a friend of mine who does drug cases in Colombo, he said his personal experience was that when he went to the police station to consult the crime notebook because he wanted to check the details of an arrest that had happened in 2012. But of course, when he flipped the notebook and he looked to the end, he found that the notebook in which the details had been recorded was actually printed in 2013. So clearly they did not record it when it happened, and they had recorded it a year later, which raises questions about the integrity of that. So we have government centers, we have private centers in Sri Lanka, and of course the treatment is not actually treatment because they are all abstinence based. There are no harm reduction services provided. I will tell you later what harm reduction is, what it means. Now, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has highlighted that denying people substitution therapies, and I think Dr. Kumaran also spoke about some of it, that it's subjecting them to severe physical pain, suffering, and humiliation, effectively punishing them for using drugs and trying to coerce them into abstinence. Violence, once again, is commonly found in both government as well as private centers, even in private centers. Now, in particular, the people who have been sentenced to compulsory treatment at the army-run Kandakadu and Senapura centers, they have spoken of the nature, everyday nature of violence. They said they experience it from the point of admission until release. And they said that they often didn't even know why they were being beaten or why they were being punished. Now, private centers are supposed to be voluntary, but what happens a lot in practice is that the families forcibly send people, and to force people, especially if they are adults, there have been cases where people have said, we knew someone in the police, so we asked them to somehow take this person to the center. Or some people have told me that they actually have paid someone in the police to take a person forcibly to a center. So this also can create room for corruption and abuse. Now, in prison, of course, there's no access to drug treatment that is evidence-based. They have things like meditation and counseling, but there's really not much evidence-based treatment. Now, if you don't have access to medicines to mitigate withdrawal symptoms, it can lead to dire health consequences or even death. When I was in the Human Rights Commission, I came across 3 such deaths in prison because the people were dependent on alcohol or drugs. And when they went into prison, they had withdrawal symptoms, they started acting up, the prison officers used violence against them, and they died as a result of it. And also, when you send people who use drugs to prison, you also create a market for drugs in prison. Now, that is also something that happens. Now, this can lead to drugs being smuggled into prison and sold at really high prices, once again leading to a lot of corruption in the system. Now, evidence shows that compulsory drug rehabilitation is ineffective. It drives people to relapse quicker and is also a human rights violation. Now, I have interviewed many people who were sent to compulsory drug rehabilitation, and they said that they actually relapsed several times. And they've also been to more than one drug rehabilitation center. Plus, globally, if you look, there are studies on this that show through evidence that it does not work. In Sri Lanka, there's also very little post-release care or support. So if they go to the centers, they're released, they go home, there isn't much support, there isn't follow-up, they don't have ways to get jobs. Because they went to the centers, and Dr. Kumaran mentioned stigma, they are stigmatized, so they can't get jobs. They're often harassed because if some drug related offense is happening, the police think, oh, this person could be involved. So they also are harassed. And the stigma, many people I interviewed said that the stigma was also one reason, key factor in them starting to use drugs again. Because they said they were not accepted, they felt frustrated, they felt depressed, so they started using because they felt society did not want them. Sometimes they felt even their families did not want them. There's also a letter, and I think Judge Anand Raja would have seen it, is that in June 2022, the National Dangerous Drugs Control Board, they wrote a letter to the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense sent that letter to the Ministry of Justice. The Ministry of Justice sent it to the Judicial Services Commission. And in September, the Judicial Services Commission sent it to all High Court judges, to magistrates, to everyone. And what they said in that letter is, due to lack of space, economic crisis, high costs, please consider all those factors and to reduce the 1-year rehabilitation, compulsory rehabilitation, to 3 months. Now, if you can just randomly, based on cost, if you can reduce it from 1 year to 3 months, is that scientific based? Is that evidence based? It's like overnight they decide we can. So that actually calls into question the effectiveness of the 1-year program. Why do we need to have it for 1 year then, if you can just have it for 3 months and it's okay? Now, violence at Kandakadu and Senapura. I have put some quotes here. One person says, you can't escape from Kandakadu. They will break your legs. You get used to a routine. The body gets used to punishments and beating. Another person described being handcuffed to a tree for 3 days. During this time, he had to remain standing the whole time, and he was released only to eat and use the bathroom. Food and water were brought to him, and he was not allowed to sleep. Now, this was supposedly punishment because he got into a fight with someone else. Then another person said, if one person makes a mistake, everyone is beaten. In this case, they were all singing a song. The counselor thought the song was making fun of him, and as a result of which, all of them were punished. And of course, the common punishments were, you had to remain in the push-up position, or you're beaten with a horse or a stick. Now, in 2022, this year, you might have seen in the media, there were 2 incidents at Kandakadu. June 29th, 1 man was killed and hundreds escaped. And all this was, I think, shown on various news channels. I'm just quoting some of them. They said the people who escaped said, we are suffering. Send us to prison. If the family hadn't called, they would have killed us. The other person said, we were sent here to be reformed, but they are not treating us. They are killing us. A man who said he had been assaulted at the center said he was denied medical attention. He said, they told me to go home and get medicine. Then 2 Army and 2 Air Force personnel were arrested in relation to the death. Now, more recently in November also, there was a clash at Kandakadu and several hundred persons escaped and 200 people were remanded. So we can see that these centers really don't work. They are creating conflict, people are being subject to violence, and when you're subject to violence and treated in a degrading manner, you're only going to become angry at society, angry at humanity. You're not going to be reformed. You will not want to come out and actually be a good citizen. So there are various international human rights standards. I mean, I won't go over them, but there are various standards that says that that compulsory drug rehabilitation is a violation because you need to consent to treatment. And compulsory drug rehabilitation can also constitute torture, cruel, or inhuman and degrading treatment. Even at the level of the United Nations General Assembly, they have said this. So then we have laws here. I'll just quickly go through them. We have the Poisons, Opium and Dangerous Drugs Ordinance. That is the main law here. So that criminalizes, it makes it a crime to import, export, traffic, possess a wide variety of narcotics. So it's heroin, it's cannabis, opium, cocaine, and you can get the death penalty under the law. The maximum sentence as a magistrate's court is, of course, a fine between 1,000 and 10,000 rupees or imprisonment of up to 5 years. Now, if there are different sections, so if under there is a section 78(5)(a) of this law, if the case is filed under that, and they do it when people have really, really small quantities, then of course the case will be on that day and you can pay a fine and be released. But if you can't pay the fine, what happens is you are sent to prison. Now, when I was at the Human Rights Commission, we found that many people were in prison because they could not pay this fine of rupees 1,000 to 10,000, that range. They couldn't pay, so they were in prison. Now, something quite concerning happened this year, a few months ago, which is they amended this law. And by amending the law, they have given powers to a police officer to refer a person to a government medical officer to determine how much the person is dependent or how much of addiction. Now, globally, I think all the medical experts here will tell you there is no medical test to prove drug dependence. It is only possible to test whether at the time of testing you have drugs, whether there's a presence of drugs in your body at the time. So whatever this GMO does could be that it probably may not be based on scientific methods. Now, to do an assessment of drug dependence, you need an evaluation conducted by a psychiatrist, psychologist, or a licensed alcohol and drug counselor based on the information that a person voluntarily provides. So they have to voluntarily say, they have to realize they have a dependency, that they have a problem, and they have to say, I am dependent, I need help, please, give me help to deal with this. It also, the amendment, it gives police the power to refer persons to a designated treatment center if the GMO finds that the person is drug dependent. Now, the most concerning thing is there is no involvement of a judge in this process. So the policeman can just arrest anyone, produce them, get the report, and the policeman can send a person to the rehabilitation center. There is no judge or court involved. This is very, very worrying. And the amendment also says that if a person is sent to a rehabilitation center and let's say they relapse, they can't complete the treatment, then they will be prosecuted. Now, the medical professionals here will tell you that treatment for drug dependency is a very difficult and complex process, right? And relapsing is a normal part of it. But if you start punishing people for relapsing and sending them to prison, how is that helping people? Now, the National Dangerous Drugs Control Board, according to their statistics, 70% of people who receive treatment, they relapse after they're released. So therefore, prosecuting a person for not completing treatment really does not help. It only makes the problem worse. It also has another worrying section in the law, the amendment. It says that if a person is under the age of 18 when committing an offense under this law, that the person will be sent for 10 years to prison, compulsory rehabilitation, and 5 years probation. Now, if a child is involved in any of this, usually it is because they have been forced, their family is part of it, so they really should not be deemed responsible for it, and you should not be sending a child to prison for 10 years for something they probably had absolutely no control over. There are also international guidelines which says that children should not be criminalized because of drug use or possession of drugs. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has also made recommendations that children really should not be given harsh punishment, and that the best interest of the child should be central to every case. We also have another law, the Drug Dependent Persons Treatment and Rehabilitation Act, which is also quite similar. I mean, that also allows a police officer to arrest, even like they can just come home based on information they receive from a phone call, even they can come and arrest anyone, and they can produce the person for a medical test. After that, they produce the person before a magistrate who sentences the person to compulsory drug rehabilitation. Now, as I said before, in these, when the GMO, the government medical officer does the examination, often if you look at many of the reports, they don't do urine tests, or there is no toxicology screening to even ascertain, to find out whether there is a presence of drugs in the body. And as I said before, there is no medical test that can prove that a person is drug dependent. And also, we have come across cases where these laws have been misused. And we've also found that, for instance, sometimes a friend of mine recently had a case where one person in the family used this to send, because they wanted to get rid of the person, to send the person off to compulsory drug rehabilitation for 1 year. And then another family member went to court to try to get the person out because they said that it was a vendetta that they had. So quickly, what is harm reduction? We've spoken about harm reduction. I think there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about it. People say that harm reduction promotes drug use. It does not. Harm reduction is the policies, programs, and practices that aim to minimize the negative health, social, and legal impact associated with drug use, drug policies, and drug laws. So I think it was Professor who mentioned the needle and syringe programs, which we really don't have in Sri Lanka. It is overdose prevention, because there can be deaths due to overdose. And also sometimes in the market, there are drugs that are tainted. So when people take those drugs, they overdose and they die. And of course, opioid agonistic therapy. Now, what is this? it is basically where they take what are called opioid agonist methadone as a substitute. So these are medications that work to prevent withdrawal and to reduce the person's craving. People crave to use drugs, right? So to reduce the craving. Now these drugs that I mentioned have been placed on the WHO, the World Health Organization's modern list of essential medicines. So it's also something that WHO accepts, that is evidence-based, that helps reduce drug overdoses, drug deaths, prevent cravings, reduce cravings, to wean people off drugs. Now, harm reduction does not promote or encourage drug use. It helps make people healthier choices for themselves. It aims to minimize the negative health, social, and legal impacts associated with drug use, drug dependence. And at the core of it is, it seeks to keep people alive, because, to prevent deaths. And of course, there's also evidence to suggest that harm reduction, like opioid agonist therapy, it can also reduce crime and violence. So what are to finish off, the recommendations? I think we need to immediately end the involvement of security forces in drug prevention, drug treatment activities. And NDDCB, the National Dangerous Drugs Control Board, needs to be taken away from the Ministry of Public Security and placed under the Ministry of Health. And in line with the various UN statements, the government needs to take immediate steps to close compulsory drug rehabilitation centers. And they should implement voluntary and evidence and health-based treatment options, like what Dr. Kumaran was talking about. And of course, we need to review our existing laws related to drug offenses, and we need to reform those laws so that they are in line with international human rights standards. Thank you very much.